Look at this photograph. It was taken in 1867. At first, it might look like another old medical portrait. A woman seated, her face turned slightly toward the lens, the shadow of a physician's presence nearby. But the longer you stare, the more unbearable it becomes. Her face tells a story that words can barely contain. Her skin is swollen, disfigured, scarred by an illness that consumed her life. Her eyes appear heavy, half-closed, robbed of their brightness. She sits in silence, resigned not only to the disease that marked her, but to the judgment of an entire world that looked at her with fear. This woman suffered from leprosy, and in the 19th century, leprosy was not just a disease, it was a sentence. The photograph freezes more than an individual. It captures the very essence of how society saw leprosy, as something terrifying, mysterious, and shameful. People did not just fear the illness, they feared the people who carried it. Imagine living in that time. The year is 1867. The Industrial Revolution is reshaping cities. Railroads are crossing continents. Science is making bold new discoveries. But when it came to leprosy, the world was still trapped in the darkness of ignorance. No cure, no true understanding, and centuries of stigma hanging like a shadow over every patient. To be diagnosed with leprosy was to lose your place in society. You were not just sick, you were branded. Families hid it. Communities shunned it. Governments built colonies and leprosariums, places where the afflicted were sent to live and die in isolation. Once you entered, you rarely returned. This is what makes this photograph so powerful. It is not just a medical record. It is a symbol of everything leprosy meant in the 19th century: fear, exile, and dehumanization. The disease itself was cruel enough. Leprosy, today known as Hansen's disease, is caused by a slow-moving bacterium that attacks the nerves, skin, and eyes. Over time, it leads to numbness, ulcers, blindness, and disfigurement. But in the past, people did not know this. They saw only the outward signs: the swollen faces, the twisted hands, the damaged eyes. And from those signs, they built myths. For centuries, leprosy was tied to sin, to impurity, to curses from God. Even in the 19th century, when science was beginning to grow, these old beliefs still clung tightly to the disease. A scarred face was not just a medical condition. It was a mark of shame, a living punishment visible to everyone. And so, patients like the woman in this image lived under a double burden: the slow, painful decline of their bodies and the crushing weight of society's rejection. Think about what this meant day to day. Strangers avoided eye contact. Children pointed and whispered. Some crossed the street to escape even the possibility of contact. Rumors spread that leprosy could be caught through a handshake, a breath, a glance. Fear was greater than truth, and ignorance was stronger than compassion. Yet here she is, frozen in silver nitrate, preserved through time. The doctors who photographed her may have seen her as a case study, a specimen to present at lectures or in medical texts. But now, more than 150 years later, we see her differently. We see not a specimen, but a human being, someone whose life was consumed by fear, someone who bore not only the weight of illness but the crushing judgment of her society. Her face is no longer just the face of a disease. It is the face of survival, of endurance, of silent testimony. This is where our journey begins. A single photograph, a single woman, in 1867. But through her, we open a window into a world where leprosy shaped not only bodies but entire societies. A world where the disease was not only physical, but psychological, moral, and spiritual. This is not just the story of medicine. It is the story of fear. It is the story of stigma. And above all, it is the story of humanity's struggle to look at suffering without turning away. Long before the woman in the 1867 photograph sat before the camera, long before doctors debated bacteria or colonies were built in distant lands, leprosy had already haunted humanity for millennia. It is one of the oldest recorded diseases in human history, carved into scriptures, whispered in myths, and etched into the memory of civilizations. The first written descriptions of leprosy date back more than 3,000 years. Ancient Indian texts spoke of a disease that disfigured the skin and robbed people of sensation. In China, medical scrolls described patients with lesions that spread slowly, resisting every remedy. In Egypt, archaeologists have found skeletal remains thousands of years old with signs of bone damage consistent with leprosy. But perhaps the most powerful references came from the Bible. The word leper appears dozens of times, carrying not only medical weight, but spiritual condemnation. In the Old Testament, those afflicted were labeled unclean. They were commanded to live outside the camp, to tear their clothes, to cover their faces, and to shout warnings to anyone who came near. In effect, they were erased from community life, made symbols of impurity for all to see. This biblical legacy shaped centuries of fear. In medieval Europe, the diagnosis of leprosy was treated like a funeral. In some regions, priests held ceremonies where the patient was declared legally dead, as if their life had ended even though their body still breathed. Bells were placed in their hands so that others would hear them coming and keep their distance. To live with leprosy was to live in a world that believed your very presence was dangerous. And yet, the truth was more complicated. We now know that leprosy is not highly contagious. It requires prolonged contact, and most people have a natural immunity. But ancient societies did not understand this. All they saw were the scars, the disfigurement, the slow erosion of the human form. And from those images, they drew conclusions that lasted for centuries. That leprosy was a curse, a punishment, a visible sign of sin. By the time the 19th century arrived, these old beliefs had not disappeared. They lingered in whispers, in sermons, in the collective imagination. The woman photographed in 1867 inherited not only the disease, but thousands of years of stigma. To her neighbors, she was not just sick. She was part of a legacy of fear older than empires. But leprosy was not only feared in Europe or the Middle East. Across Asia, Africa, and the Americas, cultures developed their own interpretations. Some saw it as the result of bad spirits or broken taboos. Others believed it was a disease of the poor, a consequence of unclean living. Everywhere it appeared, it carried the same weight: shame, exile, and silence. The paradox is striking. While other diseases killed quickly, plagues, cholera, smallpox, leprosy moved slowly. It did not wipe out cities in days. Instead, it eroded individuals over years, turning them into reminders of something worse than death: lifelong rejection. The fear was not of dying, but of being cast out, abandoned, forgotten. And so, throughout history, leprosy became not only a medical problem, but a social tool. Communities used it to define boundaries: the clean versus the unclean, the pure versus the impure, the chosen versus the cursed. Those who suffered became living walls that reinforced society's sense of safety. By casting them out, the healthy reassured themselves that they were protected, even if they weren't. This is the ancient curse the woman in the photograph carried. Not just the bacterium, but the weight of centuries of myth. When her neighbors saw her scars, they did not see illness. They saw history itself, repeating through her body. And that is why leprosy has endured not only in the flesh, but in the imagination. It is a disease of survival, yes, but also of symbolism. It became a mirror for humanity's deepest fears, of contamination, of judgment, of being left behind. As we move forward in her story, into the 19th century, we must remember this. The stigma she endured was not born in her lifetime. It was inherited. It was ancient. It was the oldest curse humanity ever placed upon itself. By the middle of the 19th century, the world was changing at a breathtaking pace. Steam engines carried people across continents. Telegrams sent messages in seconds. Factories lit the night sky with fire and smoke. Medicine itself was beginning to transform. Anesthesia, antiseptics, and germ theory were on the horizon. And yet, for those suffering from leprosy, the modern age offered little progress. In 1867, when the haunting photograph of the young woman was taken, the weight of centuries of fear still hung heavy. To be diagnosed with leprosy in that time was to be judged twice, once by the disease and once by society. People believed the scars and swelling were not only symptoms of illness, but proof of something deeper: weakness, poverty, sin. The woman's face would have spoken louder than her voice. Her neighbors would not have seen her humanity. They would have seen only the ancient curse, alive in flesh. Religious traditions reinforced these fears. Sermons reminded the faithful that leprosy had been a punishment in biblical times, a visible mark of impurity. Even as science slowly advanced, superstition clung stubbornly to the disease. A disfigured face was read like scripture. Here was someone condemned, someone touched by divine wrath. Superstition reached beyond religion. In villages and cities alike, rumors spread that leprosy could be caught through a glance, a handshake, even by breathing the same air. People avoided those with scars as if they were ghosts walking among the living. This fear was not based on medical reality. Most people exposed to leprosy never developed it, but in 1867, truth mattered less than appearance. Governments often codified these fears into law. In parts of Europe and Asia, leprosy patients were confined to hospitals or colonies, sometimes for life. Families were torn apart, children orphaned, marriages destroyed, not by the disease itself, but by the rules society imposed. In the United States, cases of leprosy were rare, but still met with the same panic. In Europe, hospitals documented patients obsessively, using new tools like photography to record the marks of the disease. Doctors believed they were building knowledge, but the images they produced became a second prison. One that displayed the sick to the world as curiosities, stripped of identity and dignity. That is the context of the 1867 photograph. The young woman did not just sit for a medical record. She sat as a representative of everything society feared. Her image would have been studied in classrooms, discussed in journals, perhaps even displayed in lectures where doctors debated causes and cures. But to those who saw the photo outside of medicine, it was something else, proof that the curse of leprosy was still alive, even in the age of progress. For the patients themselves, life was isolation within isolation. Even when not formally locked away, many lived as outcasts. They moved through streets where people crossed to the other side. They carried the silence of abandoned friendships, of doors closed in their faces. Their bodies became public warnings, visible signs that others used to reassure themselves of their own safety and purity. And yet, despite this, many endured. Records from the 19th century describe patients who worked, who built communities within colonies, who found faith or resilience in the midst of rejection. Their survival reminds us that even in the harshest stigma, humanity persists. But the truth remains. In the 19th century, leprosy was less a medical condition than a social verdict. The scars it left on the body were matched by deeper scars left on the spirit. Every lesion, every swelling, every mark was read by society as more than disease. It was interpreted as destiny. This is what makes the photograph so haunting. We no longer see a curse. We no longer see sin. We see a human being, bearing the weight of a misunderstanding that stretched across centuries. And yet, in her time, she could never escape it. In the 19th century, to be diagnosed with leprosy was not simply to be sick, it was to be cast out. Across the world, governments and communities created a single solution for those afflicted: exile. Leprosy colonies began to appear on distant shores, in remote valleys, and on islands cut off from the world. They were designed not as places of healing, but as places of containment. Their purpose was not to cure, but to separate. One of the most infamous examples was the settlement on the Hawaiian island of Molokai. Established in the mid-1800s, it became a prison without walls. Patients were sent there against their will, often torn from their families with no hope of return. The cliffs of the island sealed them off from escape, and the sea became their barrier. Life on Molokai meant a slow fading away, surrounded only by others who shared the same fate. Similar colonies existed in Europe, Africa, and Asia. In Norway, patients were confined to leprosariums scattered across the countryside, their names entered into registries that marked them as outcasts for life. In India and the Philippines, entire villages were converted into leper colonies, where the sick lived under constant surveillance, forbidden to leave. Inside these places, existence was bleak. Food was scarce, living conditions were harsh, and medical care was minimal. Patients lived in small huts or crowded wards, where the sound of coughing and groans filled the air. Work was limited, and most were left with long hours of idleness, time stretching endlessly as they waited for death. Families were shattered by this forced exile. Husbands and wives were separated. Children were taken from their parents, raised as orphans though their mothers and fathers still lived. Letters, when they arrived, were often censored or inspected, as if the very words of the sick could carry contagion. Religious orders sometimes provided what care they could. Priests and nuns worked in the colonies, offering prayers, bandages, and comfort where medicine had no answers. Some became legends of compassion, like Father Damien in Hawaii, who chose to live among the patients of Molokai and eventually died of leprosy himself. His sacrifice became a symbol of humanity in the face of despair. But these rare acts of kindness did little to erase the overwhelming reality. Colonies were places of abandonment. To be sent there was to be erased from society. Even after death, the stigma lingered. Many patients were buried in separate cemeteries, their graves unmarked or hidden, as if the shame of the disease continued into eternity. The psychological toll was immense. For many, exile was worse than the illness itself. The disease moved slowly, often over years, but the loneliness struck immediately. Patients described the pain of being treated as ghosts, as if their humanity had been stripped away. They were not simply people with a disease. They were the unclean, the cursed, the ones no one wished to see. And yet, within the walls of these forgotten settlements, fragments of life persisted. Patients formed communities, creating their own traditions and bonds of solidarity. Music, storytelling, and faith became survival tools. Even in the shadow of stigma, they found ways to reclaim fragments of dignity. The colonies of the 19th century reveal a painful truth. The greatest cruelty of leprosy was not in the body, but in the exile. To be separated, abandoned, and silenced was to endure a suffering far deeper than lesions or numbness. It was to be erased while still alive. This is the legacy of leprosy in that century, not just scars on the skin, but scars left on the soul. For most of history, medicine was not the first authority people turned to in the face of disease. Religion was. And when it came to leprosy, the verdict of faith was devastating. Sacred texts across cultures described leprosy not as a condition of the body, but as a judgment on the soul. In the Bible, lepers were commanded to live apart, to shout warnings of their presence, to carry the label of unclean. In many interpretations, the disease was seen as a punishment for sin, a visible mark of God's disfavor. This belief did not remain in the pages of Scripture. It shaped law, custom, and daily life for centuries. By the 19th century, when medical science was beginning to change the understanding of other diseases, leprosy remained weighed down by this religious inheritance. Priests and preachers often reinforced the idea that the afflicted carried a moral burden. Their lesions were read like signs from heaven, proof of impurity, evidence of transgression. A scarred face was more than a medical symptom. It was a sermon, a warning to others. Families internalized this stigma. Some believed that a relative's illness brought shame upon the household, a mark of dishonor passed down by God. Husbands abandoned wives, parents disowned children, all under the weight of belief that the disease was more than physical. Superstition thrived alongside religion. In rural villages, leprosy was blamed on curses, witchcraft, or broken taboos. People whispered that it could spread through a glance or linger in the breath of the afflicted. These stories turned patients into pariahs, feared not only for their appearance, but for an invisible aura of danger that seemed to follow them everywhere. The union of superstition and faith justified harsh measures. Exile to colonies was not presented only as medical policy, but as moral necessity. To remove the unclean from society was to protect not just bodies, but souls. Entire communities felt cleansed by the act of pushing the sick beyond their borders. Yet religion was not only an instrument of fear, it also provided some of the rare examples of compassion. Missionaries, priests, and nuns entered colonies, offering comfort when doctors had no cure. They bathed wounds, prayed with the dying, buried the forgotten. Figures like Father Damien of Molokai became legends, not for conquering the disease, but for choosing to share in its suffering. His presence in the Hawaiian colony gave dignity to people who had been stripped of it by the rest of the world. Still, these stories of kindness could not erase the larger reality. For the vast majority, religion deepened isolation. The belief in leprosy as divine punishment ensured that stigma clung even to the grave. In some places, those who died with the disease were denied burial in consecrated ground, their bodies laid instead in separate plots, reminders of their supposed guilt. The psychological toll was immense. Imagine carrying not only the weight of illness, but the suspicion that your very suffering was proof of sin. Imagine neighbors crossing themselves when you passed, children pointing and whispering, sermons that used your body as a metaphor for impurity. This was the daily reality for countless people in the 19th century. Science would eventually prove that leprosy was not a curse, not a punishment, not even easily contagious. But in the 19th century, the shadows of faith and superstition were stronger than the light of reason. And so the disease remained more than an illness. It was a symbol, a myth, a mark of God that condemned the innocent to lives of shame and silence. This burden of belief, heavier than the disease itself, is what turned leprosy into one of the most feared conditions in human history. By the 19th century, medicine was beginning to transform. Anesthesia was emerging, antiseptics were being tested, microscopes revealed worlds unseen. But for leprosy, progress lagged behind. The disease remained shrouded in mystery, and the treatments offered were often as cruel as the illness itself. Doctors had no antibiotics, no real cures. Instead, they relied on remedies passed down through centuries, many rooted more in superstition than science. Patients were subjected to harsh regimens that promised relief but delivered only more suffering. Mercury was one of the most common prescriptions. Already infamous for its use in treating syphilis, mercury was believed to purge impurities from the body. Patients swallowed it, rubbed it into their skin, or endured injections. The results were devastating: tremors, ulcers, organ damage, and in many cases, death, not from leprosy, but from poisoning. Other treatments included baths in sulfur, arsenic-based concoctions, or applications of oils that burned the skin. Some doctors experimented with chalmugra oil, extracted from a tree in India. Applied to the skin or injected, it caused severe reactions and unbearable pain. For some, it seemed to slow the disease, but for most, it offered little more than suffering disguised as medicine. Bloodletting, an ancient practice already falling out of favor, was still used in some regions. Doctors cut veins, convinced that draining bad blood could cleanse the body of disease. Patients, already weakened, often collapsed under the strain. And always, the treatments were accompanied by documentation. Medical schools and hospitals meticulously recorded cases, photographing patients to track progress. The images show bodies covered in lesions, faces swollen, hands clawed by nerve damage. These records were meant to serve science, but for patients, they were another layer of humiliation. A reminder that their agony was being studied, not relieved. Yet within this bleak landscape, cracks of light began to appear. In Norway, a physician named Gerhard Armauer Hansen dedicated his life to studying leprosy. He rejected the old idea that the disease was hereditary or a divine punishment. Instead, he sought a scientific explanation. In 1873, Hansen made a groundbreaking discovery. Under the microscope, he identified the bacterium responsible for leprosy, later named Mycobacterium leprae. It was the first time a human disease was linked directly to a microorganism. Hansen's work placed leprosy within the framework of modern science, shifting it from curse to infection. But progress was slow. Even after Hansen's discovery, effective treatments remained elusive. Many doctors dismissed his findings or clung to older theories. Patients continued to endure brutal cures that did little more than prolong suffering. The contrast was stark. On one side, the birth of germ theory, microscopes, and modern medicine. On the other, patients still being rubbed with mercury ointments or injected with chalmugra oil. The 19th century was an age of transition, but for those with leprosy, it was a transition that came too late. The psychological impact of these treatments was as severe as the physical. Imagine being told to swallow poisons, to endure searing injections, to bleed for the sake of balance. Imagine knowing that every remedy promised hope but delivered despair. Patients endured not only the disease but the cruelty of a medicine still finding its way. And yet, without this painful history, progress would not have come. The failures, the false hopes, the photographs, and the suffering all laid the groundwork for a deeper understanding of leprosy. Hansen's discovery marked the beginning of a new era, one where science would slowly, painfully, begin to replace superstition. But in the 19th century, for those living with the disease, the cure was always out of reach. The treatments scarred as much as they healed, and the promise of relief remained just that, a promise never fulfilled. The 19th century was not only an age of science, it was also the age of photography. For the first time in history, human suffering could be captured with mechanical precision, frozen forever in glass plates and silver nitrate. And for patients with leprosy, this new technology was both a record and a sentence. Doctors quickly realized the power of the camera. Unlike drawings or written descriptions, photographs revealed details that no artist could soften. The swollen hands, the claw-like fingers, the lesions that spread across skin, the hollowed eyes of patients fading into blindness. Photographs became evidence, proof that could be studied, published, and presented at medical lectures. Hospitals and asylums across Europe, Asia, and the Americas began photographing their leprosy patients. Some were posed formally, seated against dark backdrops. Others were stark, full-body images showing every mark of the disease. These portraits stripped patients of identity, turning them into case studies, into examples of pathology. The intent was scientific. Physicians believed they were documenting the progression of the disease, creating archives that would help future generations. And in some ways, they were. Today, these photographs provide invaluable records of how leprosy appeared before modern treatments existed. They allow us to see what the written word often failed to describe. But there was another side. To the patients, the photographs were yet another humiliation. They were told to sit still, to expose their scars, to let strangers capture their suffering with cold precision. Few, if any, gave consent. Their images circulated through journals and conferences, their faces studied by men who knew them not as people, but as cases. And beyond the walls of medicine, these images sometimes slipped into the public eye. They were shown in exhibitions, printed in newspapers, or whispered about in private collections. To the untrained viewer, they did not represent science. They represented fear. The photographs reinforced the idea that leprosy was grotesque, terrifying, inescapable. This duality, scientific progress and social stigma, defined the role of photography in the history of leprosy. On one hand, it helped establish a visual record that advanced medical knowledge. On the other, it reduced individuals to spectacles, fueling the very fear that isolated them. Imagine the impact on a society already terrified of the disease. People who had never met a leprosy patient could now see their faces in chilling detail. The scars, the disfigurement, the silent suffering. It all became part of the public imagination. The disease no longer lived only in rumor or scripture. It was there, on paper, undeniable and unforgettable. Yet even as photography deepened the stigma, it also preserved the humanity of those it exploited. When we look at those portraits today, through modern eyes, we no longer see just cases. We see individuals, people who lived, suffered, and endured. Their images, once meant to strip them of identity, now give them back their voice. This is the paradox of medical photography. It dehumanized, and yet it immortalized. It fueled fear, and yet it created memory. The history of leprosy cannot be told without these photographs. They remind us of the cold gaze of science, of the curiosity that sometimes overshadowed compassion. But they also force us to confront the reality of the disease, to look directly into the eyes of those whom history tried to erase. And in that confrontation lies something powerful. For the first time, we are not relying on second-hand accounts or distant myths. We are looking directly at the human cost of fear, stigma, and exile. The camera, meant to be objective, captured more than lesions and scars. It captured silence. It captured abandonment. It captured the humanity that society tried to deny. And so, even in their exploitation, these photographs have become windows, not only into the disease itself, but into the deeper truth of what it meant to live and to be forgotten with leprosy. For those who lived with leprosy in the 19th century, the disease did more than damage flesh, it erased lives. The scars were visible, yes, but the deeper wounds were carved in silence, in abandonment, in the emptiness left when society turned away. Isolation was not just physical, it was emotional exile. Patients carried the heavy knowledge that they were feared, rejected, and despised. They were treated as though their very existence was a threat. Friends stopped visiting. Families severed ties. Entire communities pretended they no longer existed. Imagine the crushing weight of that loneliness. To know that your illness did not only strip your health, but also your identity. To know that the moment the word leprosy was spoken, you ceased to be a person in the eyes of others. You became a warning. For many, the pain of rejection was worse than the disease itself. Letters from patients in colonies described the ache of being forgotten, the despair of waiting for visits that never came. They wrote about watching healthy children laugh from a distance, knowing their own children were growing up without them. They described the hollow silence of nights spent in wards where every face carried the same look of abandonment. The stigma seeped into every detail of life. Even the simplest gestures of humanity were denied. Patients were avoided in markets, barred from churches, forbidden to share meals with others. Their touch was considered contamination, their breath a curse. They were ghosts walking in daylight, present but unseen, alive but erased. Psychological torment grew in the absence of hope. The disease progressed slowly, over years, giving patients endless time to feel the sting of rejection. Some became withdrawn, resigned to invisibility. Others fought back in small ways, forming bonds with fellow patients, carving out fragments of dignity in colonies that treated them as less than human. But always, the isolation was there, a prison without walls. Religious condemnation deepened the pain. Sermons reminded the afflicted that their scars were signs of sin, that their suffering was a message from God. Patients who had once been faithful were told their illness was proof of divine wrath. For some, faith became a source of comfort. For others, it became a wound too deep to heal. And yet, within this silence, there was resilience. Some found ways to endure by creating small communities of support. They shared songs, prayers, stories, anything to remind themselves that they were still human. Music echoed in colonies where despair reigned. Laughter, rare but real, broke through the silence of exile. These moments did not erase the pain, but they offered fragments of hope. Still, the psychological scars of leprosy often lasted longer than the physical ones. Even in the rare cases where symptoms subsided, the stigma remained. A person once labeled as a leper carried that mark forever, unable to escape the shadow of rejection. Employers refused to hire them. Families hesitated to welcome them back. Society clung to its fear long after the body had healed. This is why leprosy became not only a medical disease, but a social one. It was not just the bacterium that destroyed lives. It was the collective fear of entire communities. And fear, once rooted in imagination, proved more destructive than any infection. The prison of leprosy was built not from stone, but from silence. It was enforced not by guards, but by neighbors. It was lived not in chains, but in the absence of touch, in the void where love should have been. To understand leprosy in the 19th century, we must look beyond the lesions. We must see the emptiness, the loneliness, the voices silenced by stigma. Because in the end, what killed most was not the disease itself, but the world's refusal to see those who carried it as human. For thousands of years, leprosy had been wrapped in mystery. It was seen as a curse, a punishment, a mark of sin. Generations of priests, rulers, and ordinary people carried the belief that it was something mystical, untouchable, beyond human understanding. But in 1873, the silence broke. In Norway, a young physician named Gerhard Armauer Hansen looked through a microscope and saw what no one else had ever seen before. Inside the tissues of a patient with leprosy, he identified tiny, rod-shaped organisms. He realized that leprosy was not a curse. It was not hereditary. It was not divine punishment. It was caused by a bacterium, a living microbe that attacked the body. The discovery was revolutionary. For the first time in human history, leprosy had a name, a cause, a place in the emerging science of microbiology. Hansen's work marked the dawn of a new era, where diseases were explained not by myth, but by microbes. And yet, this breakthrough was met with skepticism. Many doctors resisted the idea. Some still clung to the belief that leprosy was hereditary, passed down like a family curse. Others dismissed Hansen's findings as unproven, unwilling to abandon centuries of assumptions. Change, even when illuminated by science, was slow. Meanwhile, for patients, little changed. Colonies remained full. Exile continued. Fear endured. Hansen's discovery explained the cause, but it did not bring a cure. People with leprosy were still treated as outcasts, their lives erased by stigma that no microscope could erase. Still, the significance cannot be overstated. Hansen's work was a turning point, not only for leprosy but for medicine itself. His identification of Mycobacterium leprae was the first time a bacterium had been linked directly to a chronic human disease. It helped build the foundation for germ theory, the scientific revolution that would transform medicine in the late 19th century. From that moment, doctors began to see leprosy differently. It was no longer an abstract curse, it was an infection. This opened the door to new questions. How did it spread? Could it be treated? Could it be prevented? The answers would take decades, but the path forward had finally begun. For Hansen himself, the discovery brought both fame and controversy. He was celebrated as a pioneer, yet criticized for some of his methods. In his determination to prove that the disease was caused by bacteria, he performed experiments without consent, sparking ethical debates that still echo today. His legacy is thus both groundbreaking and complex, a reminder that progress often comes at a human cost. But what matters most is what his discovery meant for the future. It shifted leprosy from the realm of superstition into the realm of science. It proved that even the oldest, most feared diseases could be understood. It cracked open the prison of myth and showed that the truth lay not in curses or sins, but in microbes too small to see with the naked eye. And yet, as powerful as this revelation was, it did not erase centuries of fear. The stigma remained stronger than science. Even as doctors slowly accepted Hansen's findings, society continued to treat leprosy patients as outcasts. Colonies stayed open, families stayed broken, graves stayed separate. It would take not only science, but also compassion to heal those wounds. And compassion, tragically, was still far behind. Hansen's discovery was a spark of light in the darkness. But for those living with the disease in the 19th century, the shadows remained. Hansen's discovery in 1873 gave leprosy a cause, but it did not give patients relief. For decades, the disease remained an unsolved puzzle, its victims still trapped in colonies, still burdened by stigma. The 20th century would finally bring change, but only slowly, and only after generations of suffering. The first real hope came from an unlikely source, the seeds of a tree. For centuries in India, traditional healers had used chalmugra oil to treat skin conditions. In the early 1900s, Western doctors began experimenting with it against leprosy. Patients swallowed the thick, bitter oil or endured painful injections. The results were inconsistent, often agonizing. For some, the oil slowed symptoms. For others, it did nothing at all. Still, it was the first treatment that seemed to offer even a glimpse of hope. Hospitals across Asia and Africa began using chalmugra oil as their standard remedy. Patients lined up for injections that left scars of their own. The process was brutal, but it was the first step toward breaking the hopelessness of the past. For the first time, leprosy was not seen as entirely untouchable. But real progress would not arrive until the age of antibiotics. In the 1940s, scientists developed sulfone drugs, especially dapsone, that showed true effectiveness against Mycobacterium leprae. For the first time in human history, a medicine could halt the disease at its root. Patients who had been confined for life now had the chance to live outside colonies, to see their symptoms controlled, to hope for reintegration into society. The impact was extraordinary, but far from immediate. Dapsone treatments had to be taken for years, often for life, and resistance developed quickly when the drug was misused. Colonies did not close overnight. Stigma did not vanish. But for those who had known only exile, it was a revolution. A diagnosis of leprosy no longer meant certain lifelong isolation. In the 1970s, another breakthrough came: multi-drug therapy, a combination of dapsone, rifampicin, and clofazimine. This regimen, recommended by the World Health Organization, transformed the treatment of leprosy. For the first time, patients could be cured. Not just controlled, cured. The effect was global. Millions of patients received free multi-drug therapy through international programs. Colonies began to shrink, no longer prisons of the living dead, but communities in transition. Families were reunited. Children once marked for separation could remain with their parents. The disease that had haunted humanity for millennia was finally, truly, being defeated. But the road was long, and even as medicine advanced, stigma lingered. In many countries, laws that isolated leprosy patients remained on the books until late in the 20th century. In India, patients were barred from public transport, denied marriage rights, excluded from jobs. In some regions, these laws persisted well into the 2000s, proof that while the bacterium could be cured, fear took much longer to heal. And even today, though cases have dropped dramatically, leprosy still exists. Each year, thousands of new patients are diagnosed, mostly in parts of Asia, Africa, and South America. The treatments work, but the stigma endures. For some, the word leprosy still carries the echo of centuries of fear. The story of the cure is therefore not just about medicine. It is about humanity's struggle to overcome its own imagination. Antibiotics ended the bacterium's power, but it took compassion, education, and persistence to break the chains of stigma. The long road to a cure shows us something vital. Progress is never only scientific. It is social. It is moral. It is about choosing to see those who suffer not as cursed, not as outcasts, but as human beings deserving of dignity. For thousands of years, leprosy has been more than a disease. It has been a mirror, reflecting not only the frailty of the body, but also the fears and prejudices of society. It showed us how quickly communities can cast out their own, how easily myths can outweigh truth, how suffering can be multiplied by rejection. The lesions and scars of leprosy were not the greatest wounds. The greatest wounds were the ones inflicted by fear. Families abandoned, friendships broken, lives erased in silence. And yet, within that darkness, we see something else: resilience. Even in exile, patients formed communities. Even in stigma, they found faith, music, laughter. Even in abandonment, there were voices of compassion, nuns, priests, doctors, and fellow patients who chose to see humanity where others saw only curse. The story of leprosy is the story of progress at its most fragile. From centuries of superstition to Hansen's discovery of the bacterium. From painful oils and poisons to antibiotics that brought real cures. From colonies of despair to programs of healing and reintegration. The journey was long, and it is not over, but it reminds us that ignorance does not last forever. Still, the question remains: why did it take so long? Why did we allow fear to blind us for centuries? Why did entire societies choose exile instead of empathy, rejection instead of care? The answers are uncomfortable. Leprosy became a canvas on which humanity projected its darkest instincts. The need to create outsiders, the fear of what is different, the temptation to see suffering as punishment. That is why its history matters, not only for those who endured it, but for all of us. Because every age has its own leprosies, illnesses, conditions, or identities that become excuses for exclusion. The past shows us how easy it is to justify cruelty when fear takes control, and how vital it is to resist that impulse. The cure for leprosy is now real. The bacterium can be defeated. But the deeper cure, the cure for stigma, for rejection, for the instinct to cast out, remains a work in progress. Even today, in some corners of the world, the word leper is still used as an insult, a reminder that old wounds heal slowly. And so, the story of leprosy is not just about medicine. It is about us. It asks whether we will repeat the same mistakes, whether we will allow fear to define our response to suffering, or whether we will choose compassion instead. The 19th century gave us haunting images. Patients photographed as specimens, colonies filled with the forgotten, lives marked by exile. Those images are hard to look at, but they are necessary. They force us to confront what fear can do when it goes unchecked. They force us to see the humanity that was denied for so long. In the end, leprosy is not only a story of disease. It is a story of dignity lost and, in some cases, dignity reclaimed. It is a story of silence broken by science, of exile challenged by compassion, of myths shattered by truth. When we look back at this history, we should not see only suffering. We should see warning. we should see resilience. And above all, we should see the enduring call to treat every human being with the dignity they deserve. Because if leprosy teaches us anything, it is this: the true measure of humanity is not how we treat the healthy, the strong, the powerful. It is how we treat the vulnerable, the forgotten, the ones marked by scars we do not understand. That, in the end, is the legacy of leprosy. A reminder etched not just in medicine, but in morality. A story we cannot afford to forget.